The stepmother didn't even look up from her coffee when she said it. "We've arranged the marriage. Gideon Mercer. You leave within the month." Mara stood in the doorway of her own kitchen, the kitchen she had cleaned, cooked in, and kept running for 11 years, and felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Not because she was surprised, because some part of her had always known this family saw her as inventory, not a daughter. She was 31 years old. She had calloused hands and a ledger memorized by heart. She had saved this ranch 3 times over, and not once had anyone said thank you. And now they were selling her to a 60-year-old banker like a bad debt being transferred. If that were you, standing in that doorway, what would you do? Before we go any further, if you've ever been the person in the room that everyone uses but nobody sees, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city or country in the comments below so I can see just how far this story travels. And stay until the very end, because what happens to Mara Whitlock will leave you breathless. Now, let's go back to where it really began. Red Hollow, Montana, October 1887. The first hard frost had come 2 weeks early that year, which meant the east pasture fence needed reinforcing before the ground locked up completely, which meant Mara Whitlock had been awake since 4:30 in the morning, driving iron stakes with a mallet she could barely lift by noon. Her hands had stopped hurting somewhere around the 3rd hour. That was the thing about pain. It didn't disappear so much as it found its level, became background noise, something you stopped listening to because listening didn't change anything. She drove the last stake at 1:30 in the afternoon, tested the line with both hands, and decided it would hold through February if nothing catastrophic happened. Then she picked up her tools, walked back across the frozen grass, and went straight past the house without stopping. She didn't stop because she could already hear her stepmother's voice through the kitchen window, and she wasn't ready to absorb whatever that voice had prepared for her today. Instead, she went to the barn, sat down on an overturned bucket near the water trough, and allowed herself exactly 4 minutes of stillness. Her name was Mara Whitlock. She was 31 years old, brown-haired, with the kind of face people describe by saying nothing at all. Not plain exactly, not striking, just present, there. Forgettable in the way that a fence post is forgettable until you need to lean on something. She knew what people in Red Hollow said about her. She wasn't stupid, and Red Hollow was a small town in the way that small towns are almost deliberately cruel, where privacy was a luxury nobody could afford, and gossip moved faster than weather. They said she was built for work, not love. That was the charitable version. The less charitable version, the one she'd heard Mrs. Halstead whisper to Reverend Price outside the general store 2 years ago, was that some women were simply not made for men to want, as if desire were something a woman either deserved or didn't, like an inheritance. As if Mara's worth had been assessed at birth and the figure had come back low. She had been 15 when her father remarried. Dorothea Whitlock, née Crane, had arrived with 2 daughters, Cecile and Faye, both of them lovely in the way that seemed effortless from the outside. Cecile had her mother's cheekbones. Faye had her mother's laugh. Neither of them, as far as Mara could observe, had ever fixed a water pump or argued a feed merchant down to a fair price. But that was fine. That wasn't their job. Their job, as Dorothea had made clear within the first 6 months, was to be admired and eventually married well. Mara's job was everything else. She hadn't resented it at first. Grief does strange things to a person's sense of what's normal, and Mara had still been raw from losing her mother, still operating in that fog where nothing quite feels real yet. She'd thrown herself into the ranch work because moving was easier than feeling, and by the time the fog lifted, the arrangement had simply calcified into fact. She worked. They were waited upon. Her father looked at the floor. That was the part that had cost her the most over the years. Not the calluses, not the cold mornings, not even the whispers in town. It was watching her father nod along to Dorothea's decisions, as if his first daughter had become a stranger he didn't quite know how to address anymore. Harold Whitlock was not a bad man. That was the complicated thing. He was simply a weak one. He loved the path of least resistance the way some men love whiskey, steadily, without drama, and with absolute commitment. He never raised his voice at Mara. He never insulted her. He simply directed his attention elsewhere, consistently and thoroughly, until his absence from her life became as familiar as wallpaper. By 31, Mara had stopped expecting anything different. She finished her 4 minutes of stillness, stood up, rolled her shoulders, and went into the house to start supper. The kitchen was warm. Cecile was sitting at the table reading a catalog from a Denver dress shop, her hair pinned up in the loose, fashionable style she'd copied from a magazine. She didn't look up when Mara came in. "The stove's been cold since noon," Cecile said. "Faye wanted soup, but nobody started anything." "I was fencing the east pasture," Mara said. Cecile turned a page. Mara built the fire back up, checked the bread she'd left to rise that morning, and started the soup without being asked and without commenting further. This was not resignation. This was strategy. She had learned, over the years, that engaging Cecile's complaints was like trying to bail out a boat with a thimble. You'd go under long before you made a dent. Dorothea appeared in the doorway at 5:30, already dressed for the evening as if they were expecting company, which they were not. "The Hendersons are selling their north quarter," she announced, addressing no one in particular. 40 acres with water rights. Harold is going to approach them tomorrow. Mara's hands slowed. "With what money?" There was a pause that lasted just long enough to mean something. "That's Harold's concern," Dorothea said. "We're 2 months behind on the mill note," Mara said, keeping her voice level. "If we take on more land debt right now, the payment schedule—" "I said," Dorothea repeated, with the particular quiet patience of a woman who had learned that a lowered voice was more effective than a raised one. "That is Harold's concern." Mara stirred the soup. She did not say anything else. After supper, when the dishes were done, and the kitchen was clean, and the fire was banked for the night, she went to the small desk in the corner of her bedroom and opened the ledger she kept separate from the household accounts. The one nobody knew about. The one she'd started keeping 3 years ago, when she'd realized the official books were being kept selectively. The numbers were not good. They had not been good for a long time. The ranch carried debt the way some men carried a chip on the shoulder, permanently, defensively, and with no real intention of letting it go. The mill note, the equipment loan from the spring, a quiet debt to the bank that Dorothea had taken on without discussing it with anyone, and now apparently the prospect of 40 more acres they had no business purchasing. Mara sat with the ledger open in front of her and did the arithmetic 3 times, hoping the 3rd time would give her a different answer. It didn't. She closed the book, held it in her lap for a moment, then put it back behind the loose board in the wall where she kept it hidden. There was a problem coming. She didn't know its shape yet, but she could feel it the way you feel weather. Something in the pressure of the air, something that hadn't announced itself but was already on its way. She was right. She just didn't know how right. The problem arrived 9 days later in the form of Gideon Mercer's carriage. She heard it before she saw it. The particular sound of good horses, well-fed, well-shod, moving with the deliberate precision of animals that had never been asked to work too hard, was distinct from the animals she dealt with every day, and she looked up from the water trough she was repairing in time to see the black carriage roll up the lane with the Mercer Bank's emblem on the door. Gideon Mercer stepped out like a man who had practiced every entrance he'd ever made. He was somewhere north of 60, built with the soft authority of a man who hadn't done physical labor in 30 years, but hadn't forgotten how to project the memory of it. Silver hair. A coat that cost more than Mara's entire wardrobe, possibly combined with Cecile's. He surveyed the Whitlock property the way a buyer surveys livestock, efficiently, without sentiment, tallying value. His eyes passed over Mara once and moved on. She wiped her hands on her work apron and watched him walk to the front door, where Dorothea was already waiting with both stepsisters arranged behind her like a display. Mara had seen that arrangement before. It meant Dorothea expected a proposal. She went back to the water trough. She was still working on it 40 minutes later when Dorothea's voice came from behind her, and something in the tone, not angry, not even unkind, simply declarative, the way you might announce a change in weather, made the back of Mara's neck go cold. Mercer isn't interested in Cecile. Mara's mallet paused mid-swing. He reviewed the accounts, Dorothea continued. He knows who's been keeping this ranch running. He said he wants a woman who understands work, who won't need managing. A pause. He made an offer. Mara set the mallet down slowly. She turned around. Dorothea was standing 4 feet away, hands folded at her waist, expression absolutely unreadable. "He wants to marry me," Mara said. It came out flat, not a question. "He'll clear the mill note and the Henderson land debt. In exchange, you'd manage his household. He has 3 properties. He said his previous wife couldn't keep accounts." Dorothea tilted her head slightly. "It's a practical arrangement. He's 62 years old. He's wealthy. I'm 31. Which is not, Dorothea said, with a gentleness that landed like a blade, a position from which you have many alternatives. Mara stood very still. The frost-hardened ground was solid beneath her boots. The wind was coming down from the northern ridge, the way it always did in October, and she could smell the coming cold in it. She thought about the ledger behind the loose board. She thought about the mill note. She thought about her father's face when Dorothea spoke, the way he rearranged it into neutrality so quickly you might miss the flicker of something else if you weren't watching for it. She had been watching for it her whole life. "I need to think," she said. "Mercer is returning in 3 weeks for an answer," Dorothea said, as if Mara hadn't spoken. "That's the timeline." She walked back to the house. Mara stood where she was for a long time. Then she picked up her mallet and finished fixing the water trough, because the cattle still needed water regardless of what Gideon Mercer wanted, and that had always been in the end the purest truth she knew. The work continued. The world kept requiring things from her, whether or not the world intended to give anything back. She fixed the trough. She fed the cattle. She went in and made supper. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark with the ledger's numbers arranged across the inside of her eyelids, and thought about what it meant to have your future packaged and sold while you were still standing in it. She thought about Mercer's eyes passing over her, not dismissing her, she realized, which was somehow worse. He had looked at her the way you look at a tool you intend to purchase, assessing utility, satisfied by what he found. She thought about her father. At some point before dawn, she stopped thinking and simply lay there, and in that terrible quiet between thought and sleep, something changed in her. Not dramatically. Not the way things change in stories, where a person makes a decision and becomes someone new in an instant. It was quieter than that. It was more like something that had been slowly tightening finally reached the end of its slack. She was not going to marry Gideon Mercer. She didn't know yet what that meant, practically speaking. She didn't have a plan. She had approximately $12 she'd saved from selling eggs, a skill set useful primarily on ranches that were not this one, and a family that would be furious with her. But she was not going to do it. She sat up in the dark and looked at the window, and for the first time in a long time she felt something that wasn't quite hope. Hope was too optimistic, too lightweight for what this was, but something in the family of refusal, something with teeth. It was 3 days after that decision, while she was repairing the section of fence along the road, the one anyone arriving at the ranch would see first, which was why Dorothea cared about it, and why Mara had been asked to fix it before Mercer came back, that she heard the sound of boots on the road and looked up to find a stranger watching her work. He was lean, mid-30s maybe, with the weathered face of a man who'd spent significant time outside, but not the broken-down look of a man who'd spent too much of it in hopelessness. His coat was worn at the elbows. His boots were good but old. He was carrying a bedroll and nothing else. He watched her drive a stake for a full 10 seconds before speaking. "You're driving that into frozen ground," he said. "Yes," she said. "You know it's going to crack out when it thaws." "I know." She drove the next stake. "But it needs to hold until spring, and what happens in spring is spring's problem. I have enough of right now's problems." There was a pause. "Fair enough," the man said. He didn't leave. That was the first unexpected thing about him. Most people, on the rare occasions they addressed her at all, said their piece and moved on. This one stood at the fence line with his hands in his coat pockets, not intruding exactly, just present. Waiting, almost, though she couldn't have said for what. "You looking for work?" she asked, because the alternative was ignoring him, and ignoring people took more energy than it looked. "Depends on the work. Ranch hand, cattle and fence, and whatever else needs doing. Pays not much." She paused. "The honest version is that pays barely anything." "Honest is good," the man said. "I'll take it." She studied him. He met her eyes without aggression, without performance, without the particular blankness some men put on around women they considered beneath their attention. He just looked at her directly, the way you'd look at someone you were actually speaking to. "What's your name?" she asked. "Noah," he said. "Noah Reed." She nodded once, went back to her steak. "I'm Mara Whitlock," she said. "You eat supper if you work the full day. You sleep in the barn if you stay past dark. You don't take orders from anyone in the house except me, because they'll have you painting fences, and I need fence posts driven." "Understood," Noah Reed said. And that simply, with the frozen ground under them both, and the north wind off the ridge, and the absolute mundanity of a stranger accepting a bad-paying job on a failing ranch. Two lives that had been moving on completely separate trajectories bent toward each other for the first time. Mara didn't feel it happen. She was too tired, too practical, too occupied with the weight of what was coming in 3 weeks. She drove another stake and didn't think about the man at all, except to note that he was helping now without being asked, holding the stake in position while she swung. That was useful. She noted it the way she noted everything, practically, without sentiment. She had no room for sentiment. Not with Mercer's carriage still imprinted on the back of her mind like a brand. Not with what she now understood she was going to have to do. What she did not know. What she could not have known, standing in that frozen field with mud on her boots and a problem she couldn't yet solve, was that the man steadying the fence post next to her had arrived at that road on purpose. That his worn coat had been purchased specifically for this journey. That the name Noah Reed was as carefully constructed as anything in Gideon Mercer's ledger. And that everything she was about to discover would cost both of them more than either had bargained for. Noah Reed was a terrible liar about most things, but he was an exceptional observer. That was the part Cole Ashford hadn't anticipated when he'd constructed this plan. That the watching would cost him something. He'd expected to feel detached, clinical even. He told himself he was conducting an experiment, the same way a man tests a rope bridge before trusting his weight to it. You prod it. You look for weakness. You remain objective. He had not remained objective for very long. The first morning, he'd watched Mara Whitlock climb onto the roof of the chicken coop before sunup to patch a section of shingles that had blown loose. She didn't ask anyone to hold the ladder. There was no one to ask. She braced it against the wall herself, climbed up with the shingles tucked under one arm and a hammer in the other hand, and worked by lantern light until the sky started changing color. He'd stood at the barn door drinking the coffee he'd made himself. She'd left the pot out, which he took to mean it was available, and watched her work and thought, she's been doing this alone for a long time. Not the roof. Not specifically. Just everything. The second morning he understood that the rhythm of this ranch did not begin when the family woke up. It began when Mara woke up, which was before anyone else. Because if she waited for anyone else, nothing would get started, and she'd spend the rest of the day catching up. He watched her move through the pre-dawn dark with the efficiency of someone who had mapped every step years ago and stopped thinking about it consciously. Barn first, then well, then kitchen fire, then back to barn, then whatever the day had decided to break overnight. He started getting up earlier to beat her to the barn. She noticed on the third day. "You don't have to do that," she said, coming through the barn door to find him already halfway through the morning feed. "I know," he said. She watched him for a moment. He kept working. After a few seconds, she picked up the other bucket and started on the far stalls, and that was the end of the conversation, but something shifted. Not toward warmth exactly, more like toward acknowledgement. He existed. He was useful. Those were two separate things, and she'd been clear from the beginning that she valued the second one more, which he found he respected more than he would have expected. The thing about Cole Ashford, the real Cole Ashford, the one who owned Ashford Ridge and had more acres under his name than most men in Montana would see in a lifetime, was that he had grown up in rooms where everyone knew who he was and behaved accordingly. It was exhausting in a way he'd never been able to explain to anyone, because complaining about being wealthy was the kind of complaint that earned you nothing but contempt, and rightly so. But there was something that happened to a person when every conversation they had was filtered through the other person's awareness of their bank account. You stopped being able to trust anything. You stopped being able to read anyone. He'd tried the obvious solution. He'd hired a matchmaker out of Billings 2 years ago, a discreet woman named Mrs. Farwell who had assured him she could find him a wife of genuine character. She'd sent him 3 candidates. The first had arrived knowing his exact net worth to the dollar, information he had not provided, and Mrs. Farwell had not been authorized to share. The second had spent their introductory dinner asking questions about his will. The third had been perfectly pleasant and had told him frankly, before the second meeting, that she was willing to be whatever kind of wife he needed as long as the house in Helena was included in any marital agreement. He hadn't blamed any of them, exactly. Montana in 1887 was not a place that gave women many options, and pragmatism was not the same as greed, but it had left him with the gnawing certainty that he would never know. He could never know if what a woman felt for him was real, or whether it was simply the most rational available choice. His foreman, a blunt man named Hatch, who had worked for Cole's father before him, had been the one to suggest the alternative. "Go find out what people are like when they don't know you're watching," Hatch had said, in the tone he used for observations he considered obvious. "You want to know if someone's got a good heart? You don't ask them. You watch what they do when nothing's in it for them." It had seemed reasonable at the time. It had seemed almost elegant. Cole would spend a few weeks moving through the territory as a drifter, working ranch jobs, observing people, and, if he was honest, which he tried to be, at least with himself, giving himself a break from being Cole Ashford for a while, from the weight of that name and everything it required of him. He had not planned to end up at the Whitlock Ranch specifically. He'd been moving down the valley, working 3-day jobs here and there, and the combination of the woman fixing fence alone in October and the honesty with which she'd described the pay had simply stopped him. There was something in the way she'd said barely anything that had been more real than anything he'd heard in 2 years of careful social navigation back home. So he'd stayed. By the end of the first week, he understood that the Whitlock Ranch was being kept alive by one person, and that person had been persuaded somehow that this was simply her role in the world. Not through cruelty exactly. Nobody shouted at her, nobody struck her, but through the steadier, quieter cruelty of total omission. Nobody thanked her. Nobody consulted her. Nobody asked how she was managing. She had been rendered invisible by the people who needed her most. He watched Dorothea Whitlock correct Mara's posture at the dinner table on a Wednesday evening. He was eating in the kitchen, the family ate in the dining room. This was the arrangement, and saw Mara's jaw tighten for exactly 1 second before it went smooth again, and he thought, how long has she been doing that? Swallowing things, making herself smaller. Not because she was small, but because someone had spent years teaching her the house ran more smoothly when she took up less space. That Wednesday evening, after supper was cleared, he was in the barn checking on the older mare who'd been favoring her left foreleg, and he heard voices from the yard. He wasn't eavesdropping. He simply didn't move away. Dorothea's voice carrying clearly through the cold air. "He'll be here in less than 2 weeks. You need to stop behaving as if this is still a discussion." Mara's voice, lower but steady. "I haven't agreed to anything." "Your father agreed." "My father doesn't own me." "No." A pause. "But the bank owns this ranch, and Mercer owns the bank. So if you want to have an argument about what Harold has the right to agree to, you can have it with someone who has the luxury of being wrong." Silence. 2 weeks, Mara. Start behaving like someone with sense. He heard the back door close. Then he heard nothing for a long time, which was somehow worse. When he came out of the barn 20 minutes later, she was sitting on the fence at the far edge of the yard, not doing anything. Just sitting, looking at the ridgeline. In the cold, without a coat, which told him she'd come out of the house too fast to grab one and hadn't gone back in, because going back in meant walking past Dorothea again. He went to the barn door, took his coat off the hook. He had 2. Most drifters didn't, which was one of the small details he kept forgetting to be careful about, and walked over to the fence. He didn't say anything. He just held it out. She looked at the coat, then at him, with the expression of someone deciding whether accepting something was worth the complexity of being owed. She took the coat. "You heard that," she said. "It wasn't an accusation, just an assessment." "Some of it," he said. She pulled the coat around her shoulders without putting her arms through the sleeves, which was somehow a very specific kind of not giving in, and looked back at the ridge. "I'm not marrying him," she said. He didn't answer, because she hadn't said it to him. She'd said it to the mountain. "I just haven't worked out what that means yet," she added, quieter. He leaned against the fence post and looked at the same ridge she was looking at. The stars were beginning to come through in the east, the pale cold ones that came out first in October before the real dark settled in. "What would you do," he said after a while, "if this ranch wasn't part of the equation? If the debt wasn't your problem to solve?" She turned and looked at him with an expression that was difficult to name. Not suspicious, not soft, somewhere between those two things. "That's not a useful question," she said. "The debt is my problem whether I signed any of it or not. That's how it works. Humor me." She was quiet for long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. "I'd go somewhere that needed a good set of books and an honest pair of hands," she said finally. "I'm good with numbers. I'm good with cattle. I'm good with land, better than most people who own it." She said it without pride, just cataloging. "I'd find a place that needed that and I'd build something. Small first. Then Something bigger, maybe. Something that was mine. That's not an unreasonable thing to want, he said. No, she agreed. It's only unreasonable given everything else. She slid off the fence and handed him back the coat, holding it out formally, the transaction complete. Don't feel sorry for me. I don't have any use for that. I don't, he said, which was true. What he felt was not pity. He hadn't fully put a name to it yet, but it was not pity. She went inside. He stood at the fence for a while longer. Then he went to the barn, lay down on his bedroll, and stared at the dark rafters for a long time, thinking about a woman who had just described, without knowing it, exactly the thing he'd been searching for in every careful, calculated social encounter for 2 years. Not the ambition, not the competence, though those were real. The honesty. The willingness to say this is what I want and mean it, without performing it, without calculating its effect. He had not expected this. He had not expected her. 4 days before Mercer was due to return, everything accelerated in the way that catastrophes tend to. Not all at once, but in sequence, each thing following from the last with a terrible logic. It started with the letter. Mara found it on the kitchen table on a Thursday morning, which told her Dorothea had left it there deliberately, where Mara would see it when she came in to start the fire. It was from the Territorial Bank, addressed to Harold Whitlock. Open, which meant Dorothea had read it and made the decision that Mara should also read it, because the contents were going to be useful to Dorothea's argument. The ranch was not merely in debt. The ranch was in default. 2 payments missed. The bank had extended a courtesy delay that had expired. If no arrangement was reached within 30 days, foreclosure proceedings would begin. 30 days. Mercer's offer arrived at a particularly useful moment, didn't it? Mara stood in the cold kitchen holding that letter and felt the pieces of the situation arrange themselves with horrible clarity. This hadn't been an opportunity Mercer had stumbled across. This was something he had engineered. The missed payments hadn't been accidental. The pressure had been applied from a specific direction at a specific time. He hadn't looked at her over Cecile and Faye and simply decided he wanted the practical one. He'd assessed the situation, seen that the practical one was the load-bearing wall. The whole structure depended on, and made an offer that ensured nobody in that family would have any incentive to refuse. It was, she had to admit, extremely effective. She put the letter back on the table and sat down and pressed her palms flat on the table surface, feeling the grain of the wood under her hands. Her father came into the kitchen 20 minutes later, moving carefully, the way he always did when he knew there was a conversation coming that he didn't want to have. "You saw the letter," he said. "Yes." He sat down across from her. Harold Whitlock was 54 and looked older. He had Mara's same straight nose and her same brown eyes, though his had gone pale around the edges the way some people's eyes do when they've spent too many years looking at hard things sideways rather than directly. "Mara," he started. "Did you know about the default before Mercer made his offer?" she asked. He was quiet. "Did Dorothea tell you, or did Mercer tell you?" she said. "Mercer," he said. "He came to me privately, about a month ago." He folded his hands on the table. He said he was aware of the situation, that he had a proposal, that it would resolve everything. "And you said yes." "I said I would discuss it with the family." "And Dorothea said yes." He didn't answer. "Dad." She used the word deliberately, precisely, because she almost never used it anymore, and the effect was what she expected. His eyes came up from the table and met hers, and in them she saw the flicker of something he usually managed to keep below the surface. "I am your daughter. I have been keeping this ranch alive for 6 years. Not Dorothea, not Cecile or Faye. Me. You know that. I know you know that." His jaw worked. He looked back at the table. "What do you want me to do?" he said, and the question came out genuinely. Broken open, almost, the way a question sounds when someone has stopped performing an answer and is actually asking. "If you have an answer, Mara, tell me, because I've run out of them." "I don't have one yet," she said. "But I'm not marrying Gideon Mercer. That's not an answer. That's just a fact." She got up and started the fire. He sat at the table for a while, then got up and went outside, and she heard the particular sound of a man walking with no clear destination in mind, the soft boot falls of someone who needed to move, because standing still with his thoughts was worse. She told Noah that evening, not all of it, She gave him the relevant parts, the way she gave anyone relevant information, directly, without preamble. She told him about the letter, the default, the 30-day window, and the way it had all lined up too neatly to be coincidence. She told him because he was good at details, and she'd found, over the past 10 days, that he saw things clearly when she described them. Not solutions. She didn't need his solutions. But sometimes saying a thing out loud to a person who would listen without flinching helped her see it more accurately herself. He listened. He didn't interrupt, which she'd noticed was unusual in a man. Most men had a response prepared before you finished the sentence. When she was done, he said, "The default notice, do you have the original payment schedule, the one from when the loan was taken?" "Yes." "And the payment records? What was actually submitted?" "I have copies." She'd been keeping copies of everything for 3 years. The habit had started as anxiety and become something more deliberate. "The timing of Mercer's approach to your father," Noah said. "A month ago." "When did the second payment get missed?" She looked at him. 6 weeks ago." His expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted. "He knew before the default notice was issued," he said. "He's the bank," she said. "He didn't just see an opportunity," Noah said. "He created the conditions for it." "Yes," she said. "That's what I think." They were sitting in the barn. She'd come out after supper, found him patching a harness by lamplight, and sat down on a hay bale across from him. The horses were quiet. The cold was working its way in through the gaps in the boards, and her breath was making small clouds, but she hadn't felt like going back inside yet. "What would it take," Noah said, carefully, "to get out of this without Mercer?" "Money I don't have," she said, "or time I don't have, or someone with enough standing in the territory to make Mercer's offer look less attractive by comparison." She looked at the middle distance. Any of those 3 things, in sufficient quantity, would do it. He was quiet. "The records you have," he said after a moment. "The copies. How complete are they?" "Complete enough," she said. "Why?" "Because people who engineer situations like this," he said, "usually do it more than once, and the second or third time they get less careful. If Mercer pressured your father with information from inside the bank before the official notice went out, there may be other families who can say the same thing." She stared at him. "That's not nothing," she said slowly. "No," he agreed. "It's not nothing." She looked at him, really looked, the way she rarely looked at anyone because it required a kind of attention she'd learned to ration, and thought, not for the first time, that there was something about this man that didn't quite add up. Not dishonestly, not in any way she could point to, but he thought in a way that suggested a larger frame of reference than worn coat and $3 a week ranch work. He asked questions with the precision of someone who was accustomed to having questions matter. She had been filing that observation away for 10 days, letting it accumulate, not sure yet what to do with it. "Who are you?" she said. He met her eyes. "Noah Reed?" he said. "That's your name," she said. "I asked who you are." He held her gaze for 3 full seconds, and she saw it, the fractional pause, the small decision happening behind his eyes. Not lying exactly, but not everything either. "Someone who's been doing a bad job of minding his own business," he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she let it go. Not because she believed him, exactly, but because she'd decided she could afford to let it accumulate a little longer. She had bigger problems than the mystery of a ranch hand who asked unusually good questions. 2 mornings later, she woke to the sound of horses on the road before dawn. By the time she got to the window, the carriage was already at the gate. Mercer's carriage. The black one with the emblem, but this time there was a second vehicle behind it. A smaller buggy with 2 men in it she didn't recognize. They weren't here for the answer. The answer wasn't due for 4 more days. She dressed fast, went downstairs, and found Dorothea already in the hallway in her dressing gown, which meant Dorothea had been warned, which meant this was not a surprise to everyone in the house. "What is he doing here?" Mara said. Dorothea's expression was careful. "He moved the timeline." "He can't move the timeline without—" "He owns the debt, Mara." Dorothea said it with a kind of exhausted clarity, as if they had already had this argument and the conclusion was settled. "He can do whatever he likes with it." Mercer's knock on the door was 3 sharp, authoritative raps. The 2 men in the buggy turned out to be a notary and a bank representative, there to witness and formalize whatever Mercer had decided was already agreed upon. He came into the front room in his expensive coat and looked at the room and then at Mara with the same flat assessment she'd seen in his eyes the first time. Utility, nothing more. And produced a set of documents from his case and set them on the table. The marriage contract, he said, and the debt settlement. One signature takes care of both. Mara looked at the documents. She did not pick them up. I haven't agreed to marry you, she said. Your father agreed on your behalf, Mercer said, which is legally sufficient under territorial. I am 31 years old, she said. I am not a minor. No agreement made on my behalf by anyone is legally sufficient without my own signature. Mercer's expression didn't shift dramatically. He had the self-control of a man who had won arguments for a long time by being the most patient person in the room. Miss Whitlock, the alternative to this agreement is foreclosure. Your family loses this ranch. Your father, your stepmother, your stepsisters, they have nowhere to go. I assume that matters to you since you've been carrying them considerably. He said the last sentence deliberately. He'd done his research. He knew exactly where the weight was, and he was pressing on it. It matters to me, she said steadily. That doesn't mean I'll let you use it. It's not a threat, Mercer said. It's simply the situation. I've made a generous offer. Most women in your position would understand that. He said most women in your position in the tone of a man who had calculated precisely how much that phrase would cost her. She understood in that moment that he had never for a single second considered that she might refuse. He had walked in here with a notary and a bank representative because, in his experience, the correct combination of pressure and paperwork produced the required result. He had not built in a contingency. She was not supposed to be a variable. She took a breath. She had no plan. She had $13, a set of copied ledger records, and a ranch hand who asked unusually good questions. She looked at the documents on the table. Then she said, I need a day. The offer? 1 day, she said. You have a notary here. Have him come back tomorrow morning. If I sign, you have your answer. If I don't, she met Mercer's eyes directly. Then we find out what happens next. He studied her for a long moment. She thought he was going to refuse. Instead, something almost like interest moved across his face. Not warmth, not respect, but the particular engagement of a man who had encountered an unexpected piece of the puzzle. Tomorrow morning, he said, 8 o'clock. He picked up his documents, put them back in his case, and left with his notary and his bank representative. And the black carriage rolled back down the lane, and Mara stood in the front room listening to the silence it left behind. Her father was standing in the doorway to the hallway. He'd been there the whole time. He'd said nothing. She looked at him. He looked back, and for once he didn't look at the floor. I'm sorry, he said. It was the first time in 11 years. She didn't know what to do with it. It was too late and too small, and also, at the same time, the thing she had waited so long to hear that she had stopped knowing she was waiting. I know, she said. She went out the back door. She crossed the yard. She went into the barn. Noah was there. Of course he was. He was always there. In the early mornings, in the evenings, in the spaces between everything else. Present with a consistency she had stopped noticing because it had become simply part of the barn, part of the property, part of the reliable structure of days. He looked at her face and understood immediately that something had happened. He came early, she said. I saw the carriage, Noah said. He wants an answer tomorrow morning. She sat down on the hay bale she always sat on. I bought one day. I don't know what I'm going to do with it. Noah set down the harness he'd been holding. He was quiet for a moment, in the way she'd come to understand meant he was deciding something, not stalling. Mara, he said. And something in the way he said her name, the register of it, the weight, was different from any time he'd said it before. She looked at him. There's something I need to tell you. She waited. She already knew, somewhere beneath the conscious surface, that what he was going to say would change the shape of the next day. She had known for a while that there was a shape to this man she hadn't been shown yet. My name isn't Noah Reed, he said. The barn was very quiet. My name is Cole Ashford, he said. I own Ashford Ridge, north of the valley, about 40 miles. She heard the words. She arranged them. She did not speak. I came out here because I needed to know, he said, and she could see that he'd rehearsed none of this, that he was saying it as he found it, which was the first time she'd ever seen him uncertain. Whether anyone, whether the kind of thing I was looking for, actually existed outside of... He stopped. That sounds worse than I mean it to. What were you looking for? She said. Her voice was completely level. She couldn't tell yet what she felt. There was too much of it. Someone real, he said. Someone who wasn't performing for an audience that included my bank account. He met her eyes. I found you the second day. I didn't leave because... Another stop. Because I found what I was looking for. She sat with that. You lied to me, she said. Yes. For 2 weeks. Yes. While watching my life fall apart. I know, he said. And the way he said it, no defense, no mitigation, just the full weight of what it was the thing that made her believe the rest of it. A man performing honesty would have explained. He just held it. She was quiet for a long time. Ashford Ridge, she said finally. You actually own it? Yes. How large? 12,000 acres, about 900 head. She looked at the floor of the barn. And you spent 2 weeks fixing my fences for nothing. Not for nothing, he said quietly. She stood up. She needed to move. There was too much happening inside her that stillness couldn't contain. I'm angry, she said, because she believed in being accurate. Not only angry, but angry is in there. I know, he said, and you're telling me this now because of Mercer. He didn't hesitate. Yes. I'm not going to watch you sign that document when I can do something about it. She turned and looked at him, at Cole Ashford, who had been Noah Reed for 2 weeks, who had driven stakes in frozen ground and fixed harnesses by lamplight and held out his coat in the cold, and who was, apparently, one of the largest ranch owners in the territory. What can you do about it? She asked. I have standing in this territory, he said. I have a lawyer in Billings and a banker in Helena who owes me a consideration. I have 12,000 acres that aren't mortgaged and a name that Mercer will have to think twice about moving against. He paused. And I have the question I should have asked you 2 weeks ago, except I didn't know you well enough yet to know if asking it would mean anything. She waited. I'm asking it now, he said. Not because of Mercer. Not to rescue you. I've watched you long enough to know you don't need rescuing, but because you are the most real person I have met in 2 years of looking, and I would like you to have a choice, an actual choice. Not the bank or Mercer or your father's mistake or any of that. He held her gaze. Come to Ashford Ridge, not as anyone's anything. Come and see if you want to build something there. I'll stay out of your way. You'll have your own say in how it runs. And if you decide in a month or 6 months that I'm not someone you want anything to do with, I'll set you up somewhere else and call it even. The lamp was flickering slightly between them. The horses were still. Outside, the wind had picked up, the way it did before a temperature drop. Mara looked at this man she didn't know by the right name, and she thought about what it meant to be standing in a barn at midnight, with 1 day left before a contract she hadn't signed would try to eat the rest of her life. And she thought about what he'd actually said. Not, let me fix this for you. Not, I'll handle everything. Not, trust me. He'd said, what do you want? He'd said, you have a choice. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had said that to her. She couldn't remember it ever, which was probably the more honest answer. I need to get my ledger, she said. He blinked. It was the last thing he'd expected her to say. My records, she said. The copies I've been keeping. I'm not leaving them here for Mercer to get his hands on. She moved toward the barn door, and I need my coat, the actual one. It's going to be cold. She was at the door before she stopped and looked back at him. For the record, she said, I'm still angry. I know, he said, and this isn't decided. I know. She held his gaze for one more moment. Then she went to the house, moving quietly through the dark, and she did not look like a woman being rescued, and she did not feel like one either. She felt like a woman who had been presented with a problem and had just identified a possible variable she hadn't accounted for. 30 minutes later, with her ledger under her arm and the cold rising around them both, she walked out the lane into the dark beside a man whose real name she'd only just learned, away from the life that had been arranged around her without her permission and towards something she couldn't see clearly yet, which was terrifying, and also, for the first time in a very long time, entirely hers. They rode through the night without speaking much. That was the first thing Mara noticed about Cole Ashford, the real one, the one she was still in the process of deciding what to do with, that he didn't fill silence the way most people did. He didn't explain himself further, didn't elaborate on his confession, didn't try to smooth the rough edges of what he'd told her by talking over them. He simply rode beside her in the dark and let the miles accumulate and trusted that she was capable of sitting with a complicated thing without needing it managed. She appreciated that more than she wanted to admit. The cold was serious by the second hour. Not the kind of cold that surprises you, but the kind that settles in methodically, working through layers, reminding you that Montana in late October has no particular interest in your comfort or your plans. She had her coat. She had her ledger tucked inside it against her ribs, which was slightly absurd and also completely practical, and she was aware of both of those things simultaneously. They stopped once, at a creek crossing, to let the horses drink. Cole had brought two. His own, a dark bay gelding she'd seen him ride before but assumed he'd borrowed from some previous job, and a chestnut mare from the Whitlock barn. She'd wondered, in the barn, whether taking the mare constituted theft. Then she'd decided that 6 years of labor put her well into credit on that account, and stopped wondering. "How much farther?" she asked, at the creek. 4 hours, give or take, he said. We'd say, "We can stop at the Hendry station in 2. Get warm, they'll have coffee." "I'm fine," she said. He looked at her. She was not entirely fine, her fingers were stiff and she'd lost feeling in her left ear some time ago, but she'd said it in the tone of someone reporting a fact rather than performing toughness, and he seemed to understand the distinction. "Coffee's still there if you want it," he said, and left it alone. That was the second thing she noticed. They didn't stop at the Hendry station. They didn't need to, because 20 minutes later her mind stopped cataloging the cold and started, without her permission, cataloging everything else. What she'd left behind, what she'd walked into, what she knew and didn't know about the man riding beside her. The mental activity generated enough heat to carry her through. What she knew. Cole Ashford, 40 miles north, 12,000 acres, 900 head. Lawyer in Billings, banker in Helena. A foreman named... She didn't know his foreman's name. She'd need to know that. What she didn't know. Whether he was honest beyond the confession, which was the only data point she had on that front. Whether his offer was genuine or whether it was a different kind of arrangement from Mercer's, so more comfortable perhaps, more politely constructed, but transactional in the end. Whether the anger she was carrying would solidify into something she couldn't work around, or whether it was the kind of anger that burned clean and left workable ground behind. She turned the questions over, one by one, the way she turned numbers in the ledger, not to arrive at an answer immediately, but to understand the shape of the problem. By the time the sky started going gray in the east and the first outlines of a large structure appeared on the ridge above them, she had arrived at one conclusion. She had no idea yet. And not knowing was uncomfortable, but it was honest, and she had made a decision somewhere in the last 4 hours that she was going to lead with honesty, even when it was inconvenient, because the alternative was to start making calculations that didn't include the truth. And she had watched Dorothea Whitlock do that for 11 years, and had no interest in becoming any version of that woman. Ashford Ridge appeared slowly, the way large things do. Not all at once, but in pieces. First the fence line, substantial and well-maintained. Then the outbuildings, half a dozen of them arranged with a logic that suggested someone had thought about function before aesthetics. Then the main house, which was bigger than she'd expected and simultaneously less formal. Not a showpiece, not the house of a man trying to impress anyone, but a house that had been built outward from something practical and expanded as the need came. She took it in without comment. There was a light in one of the outbuildings. A man appeared in the doorway, heavy set, somewhere north of 50, with the square face and unhurried movement of someone who had worked outdoors his entire life and reached a settled peace with it. "That'd be Hatch," Cole said. "My foreman. He knew I was coming back. He didn't know..." A brief pause. He didn't know the specifics. Hatch walked out to meet them, assessed the situation in the way of a man accustomed to making quick assessments, and landed on Mara with an expression that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite approval, but contained elements of both. "This is Mara Whitlock," Cole said. "She's going to be staying. She needs a room in the house, not the bunkhouse. And she needs..." "I can tell him what I need," Mara said. Cole closed his mouth. She looked at Hatch. "I need a room with a desk. A real one, not a vanity. I need access to whatever financial records the ranch keeps, starting with the last 3 years. And I'd like to know the layout of the operation before noon today, if that's manageable." Hatch looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Cole. Then he looked back at Mara. Room's on the east side, he said. Has a desk. Books are in the office off the main hall. He paused. I'll start the coffee. Thank you, she said. He went back toward the house without further comment. Cole was quiet for a moment. He likes you, he said. He doesn't know me, she said. Hatch decides in 30 seconds. Always has. Cole dismounted, took the gelding's reins. If he'd gone back inside without talking to you, that would be a bad sign. She filed that information away and dismounted on her own without waiting to be helped. The first week at Ashford Ridge was, in the most accurate terms, disorienting. Not because anything was wrong. That was actually the problem. Things were right, in ways she kept waiting to find the catch in, and the absence of a catch was its own kind of vertigo when you'd spent 11 years expecting one. Nobody told her where to be. Nobody assigned her tasks. Nobody presented her with a list of what the household required. She was given the room with the desk, access to the books, and all this was the part she kept returning to, the apparent freedom to determine for herself what she was going to do with both. She slept for most of the first night, which surprised her. She had expected to lie awake calculating. Instead, she went horizontal on an actual mattress with actual weight of blankets and was unconscious in under 10 minutes, which was either exhaustion or her nervous system making a unilateral decision that it had been running at emergency capacity for long enough. She woke before dawn from habit, was briefly confused by the ceiling. The ceiling of the east room was higher than her bedroom at the Whitlock Ranch, and then remembered everything at once and was immediately awake in the alert, flat way of someone facing a large problem. She dressed, found the office, and spent 3 hours with the ranch's books before anyone else appeared. The books were good. That was her first real assessment of Cole Ashford that didn't involve questions of character. Whoever kept his accounts knew what they were doing. The records were complete, the categories were logical, the expenditures tracked. But they were the books of a ranch that had been run conservatively and successfully by someone good at maintaining things. And Mara, who had spent years keeping a failing ranch barely alive on creativity and determination, could see immediately where growth was being left on the table. She made notes. She kept making notes. By mid-morning, she had 4 pages of observations, 2 specific problems, and 1 larger structural question about the way the winter feed contracts were being negotiated that she suspected was costing the ranch several $100s a year unnecessarily. Cole appeared in the office doorway at about 9 o'clock. He looked at the papers spread across the desk, and then at her and said, "Good morning." "The Henderson contract for winter hay," she said, without looking up. "Who negotiates that?" A pause. "Hatch usually handles the feed contracts." "Hatch is a good foreman," she said. "But whoever he's buying from knows he's going to come back every year regardless, which means they have no incentive to offer him a better rate. If you send someone they haven't dealt with before, someone who can credibly walk away, you'd get, conservatively, 15% lower." She looked up. "That's on the hay alone. I haven't looked at the grain contracts yet." Cole was quiet for a moment. "You've been up since before dawn," he said. "I usually am," she said. "You've been here less than 24 hours." "The contracts are the contracts whether I've been here 24 hours or 2 years," she said. Then she stopped, because something in his expression made her notice herself. The forward lean, the certainty, the way she'd walked into his office and started cataloging his finances without being asked. She sat back. That's not..." She wasn't sure how to finish that sentence. "It's not what?" he said. He didn't sound annoyed, he sounded genuinely curious. "My place," she said. "I'm aware that's your business, and you didn't ask for my..." "Mara." He said her name with the same weight as the night in the barn. "I brought you here because you are the most competent person I encountered in 6 weeks of looking. If you see something in the books, I want to know about it." She held his gaze. "That's not the same as giving me authority to act on it," she said carefully. "I need to know where the line is." "But tell me where you think it should be," he said, "and we'll see if we agree." It was such a straightforward answer that it wrong-footed her slightly. She was accustomed to having her assessments either dismissed or taken without credit, not discussed, not treated as a starting point for negotiation between 2 people who both had opinions and both got to express them. She told him what she thought the line should be. He agreed on most of it, pushed back on one point with a reason she found convincing, and they adjusted. The entire conversation took 11 minutes. Then he said, Breakfast. And that was that. She was still angry. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. The anger hadn't burned out. It had settled into something lower and more persistent, a steady heat in the back of her mind that she stoked periodically when she caught herself relaxing too completely. He had lied to her. He had watched her worst weeks while hiding who he was, and whatever his reasons were, that was a true thing that required genuine accounting before she could put it anywhere useful. But she was also honest enough to notice that Ashford Ridge was doing something to her that she hadn't expected. It was giving her room to think, room to work without having the work go unacknowledged, room to eat a full meal without having to serve it first, room to sit at a desk in the evenings and do exactly what she was doing without anyone appearing in the doorway to ask why she wasn't doing something else. It was an unfamiliar sensation, having room, like standing up after years of crouching, the stretch of it slightly painful, the upright position still tentative, waiting for the ceiling to reappear. She didn't trust it fully, but she was paying attention to it. On the fourth day, Hatch stopped her on her way back from the east pasture. She'd walked the fence line, needing to understand the physical property, not just the numbers, and said with no lead-up, "You're nothing like I expected." "What did you expect?" she said. He thought about it. Cole came back different. Something had settled in him. I thought, he moved his jaw. Someone softer, someone who needed things. "I need things," she said. "Not the same kind," he said. She wasn't sure what to do with that, so she said, "The east fence has a section about 2 miles out that's been patched more than once. It needs to be replaced before spring, not patched again." "I know," Hatch said. "Been on the list." "Put it higher," she said. He almost smiled. Not quite. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She kept walking. That was the shape of the first week. The second week was when the shape changed. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, addressed to Cole, from an attorney in Billings named Percival Cross. Mara was in the main hall when Cole opened it, and she saw from across the room that his face changed in the specific way of someone reading something they'd expected but had hoped not to see. "Mercer," he said. She crossed the room and he held the letter out without hesitation, which she noted. It was written in the formal language of legal threat, polite on the surface, constructed entirely of blades underneath. Mercer alleged that Cole Ashford had interfered in a lawful contractual arrangement between Gideon Mercer and the Whitlock family. That one Mara Whitlock had been a party to an existing negotiation and had been improperly induced to abandon it. That this constituted interference with commercial proceedings, and that Mr. Mercer reserved the right to pursue damages. It was careful, it was thorough, and it was, she saw immediately, only the first move. "He's not going to sue you," she said, handing the letter back. "No," Cole agreed. "This is a signal. He's telling me he's going to make things uncomfortable if I don't send you back." "What kinds of uncomfortable?" Cole sat down on the edge of the desk. "Mercer has relationships with every significant commercial enterprise in this part of the territory. He can make it difficult to sell cattle, complicate my water rights applications, put pressure on vendors we depend on. He won't do anything openly illegal. He'll just tighten things, slowly, until the nuisance cost of keeping you here exceeds the—" He stopped. "Exceeds the value of keeping me here," she finished. "That's his calculation," Cole said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "And what's yours?" she said. He met her eyes. "You being here isn't a calculation." She let that sit for a moment before setting it aside, because she wasn't ready to deal with what it meant yet, and they had a more immediate problem. "He's going to go after the Whitlock debt," she said. "My father's still on that note. If Mercer decides to accelerate the foreclosure as pressure on you—" "I know," Cole said. "I've already contacted the bank in Helena. The note can be purchased. It'll take a week or two to arrange." She stared at him. "You were going to do that without telling me?" "I was going to tell you today," he said, "before this arrived." "That's my family's debt," she said. "Yes," he said, "and I'm not doing it as a favor. I'm doing it because Mercer using it as a lever against this ranch is a business problem, and purchasing the note eliminates the lever." He paused. "But I should have told you first, you're right." She stood with the anger of it for a moment. The instinct to refuse the help, to say she'd handle it herself, to preserve the independence she'd been building. And then she thought about her father's face in the hallway. about the missing payments, about the way Mercer had moved those pieces into position long before anyone else had seen the board. "If you purchase that note," she said, "I'm paying it back. Every dollar. With interest at whatever rate is fair." That's not negotiable," she said. He looked at her for a moment. 4%, he said. "Same rate I'd charge anyone." 5, she said. "Because I'm not anyone." Something moved through his expression that she couldn't quite name. 5%, he agreed. That evening she got out her ledger, the one she'd brought from the Whitlock barn, tucked under her coat through 40 miles of October cold, and opened it on the desk in her room and looked at the copies she'd made of payment records and correspondence and the bank's communications. What she'd said to Cole 2 weeks ago, in the barn. People who engineer these situations usually do it more than once, and the second or third time they get less careful. She had been right, and she'd known she was right even when she said it. She'd spent 3 years copying those records specifically because she had suspected something was wrong with the way the bank was handling the Whitlock account. Delays in processing that were oddly timed, a penalty charge that appeared without clear justification, a communication from Mercer's office that predated the official bank notice by 19 days. 19 days. She'd circled it in pencil when she found it and said nothing to anyone because there was no one to say it to, and because she hadn't been sure what it meant. She was sure now. She started writing. Not a complaint, not a plea, a document. An organized, dated, sequenced account of every irregularity she had observed and recorded, cross-referenced with the official records she'd copied. She wrote in the same voice she used for ledger notes, precise, flat, free of embellishment, because embellishment was what people dismissed. Facts were harder to dismiss. Facts, arranged in the right order, with dates and amounts and names attached, became something that took on its own momentum. She worked until nearly midnight. Her hand cramped at around the 10th page and she stopped, shook it out, kept going. She was not writing for herself. She was writing because there had been other families. She had heard it in town over the years. The Garrison place, sold off 3 years ago when the matriarch died and left the son with debt he couldn't manage. The Pendleton widow who'd lost her water rights in a dispute that had seemed, at the time, to simply be the law working as it worked. The Kowalski family who'd packed up and gone east and nobody had asked too many questions about why. She had been one possible victim. She suspected there were others, and others had fewer options than she'd had. Fewer years of copied records. Nobody who asked the right questions in a barn by lamplight. She was going to write it all down. Everything she knew, everything she could substantiate, and everything that, put beside everything else, pointed to a pattern that a territorial judge would have a hard time looking away from. It took her 3 nights. Cole found her asleep at the desk on the second night. She heard him come in and wake her, mildly, said she was fine, went back to work. He left a cup of coffee on the edge of the desk without comment and went back to bed. That was the 3rd night she'd been at Ashford Ridge. It was a small thing. It shouldn't have mattered. She didn't let it matter more than it did. When she finished, she had 41 pages of documentation, 2 separate narratives, one for the Whitlock account, one for the 3 other cases she could substantiate from public records and what she'd overheard over the years in town, and a cover letter addressed to the Territorial Commissioner of Financial Oversight, whose office she had found listed in a legal directory on Cole's office shelf. She showed it to Cole on the 4th morning, all of it. She put it on his desk and stood back and watched him read. He read the whole thing, every page. He didn't skim. When he finished, he was quiet for a moment, and when he looked up, his expression was one she'd seen on exactly one other face in her life. Her father's face in the hallway, just before he said, "I'm sorry for the first time in 11 years." It was the expression of someone who had just understood the full dimension of something they'd been looking at partially. He stopped. "It's 41 pages, she said. "The first section is the strongest. If they only act on one thing, that's the one. Mara." He said it the way he'd said it in the barn. "You built a legal case." "It's not a legal case," she said. "I'm not a lawyer. It's a documented pattern with dates and amounts. A lawyer makes it a case." "My lawyer in Billings," he said. "Percival Cross, not Mercer's Cross. I have my own. He could review this and file on our behalf within—" "Not on our behalf," she said. "On behalf of every family in here." She tapped the pages. "The Garrison land. The Pendleton water rights. I don't want this to be about Ashford Ridge versus Mercer. I want it to be about what he's actually done." Cole looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," he said. "Just okay?" "You wrote 41 pages in 3 nights," he said. "I'm not going to argue about the framing." She picked up the document. "I need your lawyer's address." He gave it to her. She wrote the cover letter that same afternoon, and the following morning she handed the sealed package to the writer going to Billings with a clarity in her chest that was one of the cleaner feelings she'd experienced in recent memory. It was done. What happened next was out of her hands, which was an unusual sensation for a woman who had kept everything in her hands through sheer necessity for so long. She was not sure she liked it, but she accepted it. What she did not accept was the news that came 2 weeks later in the form of a second letter. This one not from a lawyer, but from Red Hollow itself, from Mrs. Dempsey, who kept the general store and who had apparently heard from Dorothea, who had heard from a friend of Mercer's, that Mercer intended to make the hearing public. He had found out about the filing. Of course he had. Men with influence in small territories always found out, and the speed of it didn't surprise her. What surprised her was what he was doing about it. Instead of countering through legal channels, instead of fighting the documentation directly, he had announced, through the network of social connection that a man like Mercer maintained the way other men maintained property, that there would be a public hearing before the county commissioners, an opportunity for all parties to present their case, an opportunity, his people were saying, for the truth to come out. He wanted her in a room. He wanted her in front of people. He was calculating, she realized, that whatever she'd put on paper, she would not be able to sustain it in person. That a woman from a failed ranch who had run off in the middle of the night would look, to a room full of territorial officials, like exactly the kind of person whose accounting could not be trusted. He was going to use the room itself as a weapon. Cole came to find her when the letter arrived. He was holding it carefully, the way you hold something you're not sure how to present. "You don't have to go," he said. She took the letter from him and read it. "I know," she said. She folded it. "When?" 3 weeks, he said. "Helena. The commissioner's office has a public chamber." "Helena," she said, "not Red Hollow." Mercer wanted Red Hollow. The commissioner's office required Helena. That was something. Helena was not Mercer's territory the way Red Hollow was. Helena was the territory's capital, with officials who answered to interests broader than one banker's network. "You have 41 pages already." 41 pages is the foundation, she said. In a public room, with Mercer's lawyers and his commissioner contacts and probably half his business associates arranged in the seats, to make the room feel a particular way, she stopped. "I need to know every number I cited by heart. I need to know the counterarguments before they make them. I need to be able to answer anything they throw at that document without looking at the document." Cole was watching her with an expression she was still working on categorizing. "He's expecting you to be nervous," she said. "He's expecting someone who will look, in that room, like a woman who got above herself. I intend to be the opposite of that." "What's the opposite of that?" Cole said. She thought about Mercer in the front room of the Whitlock house, setting documents on the table with the confidence of a man who had never seriously encountered a no that held. She thought about his eyes moving past her like she was part of the furniture. She thought about the notary and the bank representative arranged behind him like scenery. "The best prepared person in the room," she said. She spent the next 3 weeks in the office at Ashford Ridge and didn't stop. Cole brought her meals some evenings when she forgot. Hatch taught her, at her request, the specific terminology the county commissioners used in land and water proceedings, because he'd attended 2 such hearings on the ranch's behalf and knew the vocabulary. She learned it the way she'd learned everything, by working at it until it stopped being foreign and became simply another ledger she could read. She wrote out every counterargument she could imagine and answered each one in writing alone in the office, arguing with herself out loud sometimes when the written version wasn't clarifying the thinking fast enough. Cole, appearing in the doorway one evening to find her mid-argument with an imaginary attorney, said nothing and left coffee on the desk again. There were moments in those 3 weeks when the anger she'd been carrying about his deception surfaced, and she had to set it down deliberately and return to the work. Not because it was resolved, it wasn't, but because the work was what mattered right now, and she was not going to let an unfinished emotional account compromise her preparation. But there were also moments, quieter ones, in the evenings. When the preparation was as complete as it was going to be for that day, and her mind came off the structure of the argument and noticed where she was. When she caught herself looking at the east ridge through the office window and thinking that it was a good ridge, that the way the light moved across it in the late afternoon was something she'd noticed 3 days after arriving and kept noticing. That Ashford Ridge was, despite everything, a place she had stopped being afraid of in the way she'd been afraid of most things for most of her life. She didn't say any of this to anyone. She worked. The night before the hearing, Cole knocked on the office door at 9:30 and said simply, "You need to sleep." "I know," she said. She was reviewing the 4th section of her document for the 8th time, which she was aware was no longer productive. Her eyes were doing the reading, but her brain had stopped absorbing. "Are you ready?" he said. She put the document down, thought about the question seriously, the way she thought about all serious questions. "I don't know," she said. "I've done everything I can do. Whether that's ready—" She looked up at him. "I won't know until I'm in the room." "That's the truest answer anyone's ever given me to that question," he said. She looked at him standing in the doorway of the office that had become, over 3 weeks, the place she thought most clearly. At the man who had lied to her and then told her the truth, and then, consistently, day by day, behaved like someone who meant what he'd said in the barn, who had given her the room on the east side with the good desk, who brought coffee at midnight and didn't make it a declaration, who had said you have a choice like it was the most natural thing in the world, when it had been the rarest thing anyone had ever offered her. She was still working on what she felt about him. She was aware that she was working on it. That was honest progress. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Mara," he said. She slept. Not well, and not for long enough, but she slept. In the morning they rode to Helena, and Gideon Mercer was waiting. The commissioner's public chamber in Helena was not a courtroom, but it had been arranged to feel like one. Long wooden benches filled 2/3 of the room. A raised table at the front seated 3 commissioners, men with the particular expression of officials who had been doing something long enough to be tired of it, but not long enough to have stopped caring entirely. To the left, a table for the presenting party. To the right, a table for respondents. In between, a lectern that nobody had asked to be there, but that communicated, simply by existing, that whoever stood at it was expected to perform. Mercer was already seated at the left table when Mara and Cole came through the door. He had brought 2 attorneys. Mara counted them before she counted anything else. 2 lawyers in good suits, a stack of documents organized with the confidence of people who had done this before and expected to do it again. Beside Mercer sat a man she recognized from Red Hollow, the county assessor whose name she could not immediately place, but whose face she associated with the Pendleton water rights dispute, which was not a coincidence she intended to ignore. Behind Mercer, in the gallery, sat approximately 30 people. Some of them she recognized, territorial business figures, 2 men she knew to be on the bank's board of directors, a woman who wrote the social column for the Helena Gazette. Mercer had filled his side of the room with the specific kind of audience that was meant to communicate to the commissioners that this was a man with standing, that whatever happened here happened in front of people whose opinions carried weight. He had constructed the room as a statement before anyone said a word. Cole put his hand briefly at the back of her arm, not guiding her, not steering, just there. And then they were at the right table, and she was setting down her document case and looking at what she'd walked into. Cole's lawyer, a compact, precise man named Aldous Burke, had arrived before them and was already reviewing his notes. He'd spent 2 days with Mara's 41 pages and the additional materials she'd assembled in the final week, and he'd told Cole privately, in a conversation Mara had not been part of but that Cole had relayed to her in full, that it was the most thorough voluntary documentation he'd reviewed in 15 years of territorial practice. He'd said it with the particular surprise of a man who hadn't expected to be impressed. Mara had taken that information and filed it without comment. Burke leaned toward her now. "Commissioner Aldridge is the one to watch," he said quietly. "Center seat. He's independent. He doesn't have Mercer's relationships. If we lose him, we lose the room." She looked at Commissioner Aldridge, mid-50s, neat, unremarkable, the face of a man who wanted the facts to line up correctly and felt genuine irritation when they didn't. "I can work with that," she said. The proceedings opened at 9 o'clock. Mercer's lead attorney, a man named Forsyth with a Billings address on his card, and the measured confidence of someone accustomed to territorial hearings, opened with a framing she'd anticipated almost exactly. The filing, he said, was the product of a personal dispute between Mr. Mercer and a ranch family whose debts Mr. Mercer had attempted in good faith to resolve. The documentation presented was the work of an individual with a grievance and no legal standing. The alleged pattern of misconduct was constructed from selective reading of records by someone with no formal training in financial or legal practice. He said all of this in the smooth, unhurried voice of someone who had learned that patience reads as confidence. He said it looking at the commissioners, not at Mara, which told her he'd made a calculation about her that she intended to make him regret. Then he said something she had not anticipated. He said that Miss Whitlock had, on the night of October 17th, taken a horse from the Whitlock Ranch without authorization and removed financial records that constituted family property. That these records, the foundation of her filing, had been obtained improperly. That any case built on improperly obtained materials should be considered compromised. The room absorbed this. Mara kept her face still. She had 1 second. She could feel it, the single second she had before her expression became information, and she used it to make a decision. She wrote a note on the paper in front of her and slid it to Burke. The mare is mine by 11 years of uncompensated labor. The records are copies. Originals remain with the family. Burke read it again, wrote back, "Can you substantiate the labor claim?" She wrote, "6 witnesses in Red Hollow who watched me run that ranch. I can name 4 right now." He looked at her. She met his eyes steadily. He made a small nod and wrote something in his own notes. Forsyth finished. Commissioner Aldridge made a note. The commissioner on the left, a man named Pruitt, who had not looked up from his own papers, turned a page. The third commissioner, Holloway, asked Forsyth 2 procedural questions and appeared satisfied with the answers. Then Burke stood. He was a different kind of speaker than Forsyth, less polished, more specific. Where Forsyth had painted in broad strokes, Burke dealt in numbers. He cited dates. He cited amounts. He referenced specific documents in the filing by page and paragraph number, which meant the commissioners could follow along if they chose to, which Commissioner Aldridge chose to, turning pages as Burke spoke. Mara watched Aldridge's face while Burke talked. She watched for the specific expression of a man encountering a number that doesn't match what he expected, because that expression, slight crease between the brows, almost imperceptible pause in the note-taking, was the sign of a mind engaging rather than processing. She saw it twice in the first 10 minutes. Good. Then Burke said, "At this point, I'd like to ask Miss Whitlock to address the commission directly regarding the Whitlock account documentation, as she is the individual with direct knowledge of those records." This had been their strategy, arrived at after considerable discussion. Burke would establish the legal and procedural frame. Mara would give the commission the thing Burke couldn't, first-hand account, granular detail, the human face of what the numbers described. Mercer's side of the room was very still. She stood up, walked to the lectern, put nothing on it because she had decided 4 days ago that she was not going to read from the document in this room. Reading looked like uncertainty. She knew these pages well enough to navigate them without looking. She looked at Commissioner Aldridge first. "My name is Mara Whitlock," she said. "I am 31 years old. I have kept accounts for the Whitlock Ranch in Red Hollow since I was 22. I have no formal legal training, and I want to be clear about that. What I do have is 9 years of financial records that I copied by hand over 3 years because something about the pattern of communications from Mercer's bank did not match what the official record said." She paused. Not for effect, because she wanted the next sentence to land as its own thing. On September 3, 1887, the Whitlock Ranch received a communication from Mercer's bank referencing a default on payments and notifying us of the bank's right to begin foreclosure proceedings. That notice is dated September 3rd. She let a beat pass. "I have in the filing, on page 7, a letter from Mercer's personal office to my father dated August 15th, 19 days earlier, in which Mercer states that he is aware of the account's difficulty and suggests a private arrangement to resolve it. The arrangement he suggested was my marriage to him." Aldridge's pen stopped. She continued. She went through it methodically, not dramatically, date by date, amount by amount. The penalty charge that appeared in June with no corresponding contractual provision. The delayed processing of a payment submitted in March that had been marked late, despite being submitted on time, which she could prove because she had the bank's own receipt stamp on her copy. The 19-day gap. The way the same sequence, internal communication preceding official notice, private approach before public process, appeared in the Garrison account based on county records she had cross-referenced from the public register. She had been speaking for 14 minutes when Forsyth stood. Commissioner Aldridge, the witness has no legal standing to present this material as, "She's not presenting it as evidence in a legal proceeding," Aldridge said. "She's presenting it as the basis of a filed complaint. Sit down, Mr. Forsyth." Forsyth sat. Mara continued. "The Pendleton water rights. The county assessor." She turned briefly to look at the man who had arrived with Mercer, the man from Red Hollow, and she said his name aloud, said it without accusation, just as a fact in the sequence, said that his assessment of the Pendleton property value had arrived 2 weeks after a dinner meeting between himself and Mercer's bank manager that was recorded in the Helena Social Register. She had found it in the Gazette archives, which were public. She had found it by spending one full evening in the Helena Public Library the day before the hearing because she had suspected the gap in her documentation was there and had gone to fill it. She saw the assessor's face change. Not guilt. Men like that didn't show guilt in public. Something more careful. The face of someone suddenly aware that the room's attention had touched them. "I want to be precise," she said, looking back at Aldridge. "I am not accusing anyone in this room of a crime. That is not my role here. What I am presenting is a documented pattern of timing, of when information was shared, when communications were sent, when official processes were initiated, that consistently favored one party across multiple unrelated accounts. I believe the Commission is better positioned than I am to determine what that pattern means." She stopped. She had said what she came to say. Aldridge looked at her for a moment. "Miss Whitlock," he said, "the letter you referenced on page 7, the one dated August 15th, you have the original?" "I have a copy," she said. "The original is at the Whitlock Ranch. It was addressed to my father and remains his property." "Would your father be willing to produce the original if the Commission requested it?" She had thought about this. She had thought about it at length, specifically because the answer was not obvious to her. Harold Whitlock, as of 3 weeks ago, had said, "I'm sorry," in a hallway, and then she had walked out of his life with a ledger under her coat. She did not know exactly where he stood. "I believe he would," she said, which was the honest answer. Not the confident one, but the honest one. Aldridge made a note. Forsyth requested the floor again and launched into a counter-argument that she'd prepared for. He questioned the chain of custody of the copies. He disputed her characterization of the Garrison records. He returned to the horse and the records removal as evidence of the complainant's bad faith. He was competent and thorough, and he looked at her twice during the argument with the particular expression of an attorney encountering someone who prepared better than expected. When he finished, Commissioner Prewitt, who had finally looked up from his papers, addressed Mara directly for the first time. "The account you describe of the payment processing delays," he said. "You say you have the bank's receipt stamps on your copies. How did you obtain those copies?" "When I submitted payments to the bank, I requested written receipt for each submission," she said. "I was told, on 2 occasions, that receipts were not standard procedure for this type of payment. I said I would wait while they made an exception." Prewitt looked at her for a moment. "You waited," he said. "Each time," she said. "I have a habit of waiting for the paperwork." Something happened in the room then. Not loud, not dramatic. A shift of atmosphere. 2 of the gallery members on Mercer's side exchanged a brief look. Commissioner Holloway, who had been the least engaged of the 3, wrote something down for the first time. Mercer himself had not moved. He sat at his table with the same composed authority he'd carried into the Whitlock front room, but there was something different about the quality of his stillness now. Before, it had been the stillness of a man who was certain. This was the stillness of a man being careful. She saw him look at her, directly, for the first time since she'd walked in, and she saw something in his face that she recognized. It was the recalculation. The moment when the initial assessment proves insufficient and the mind scrambles to update. He had looked at her in the Whitlock front room and seen a woman he could purchase. He had looked at her in this room for 50 minutes and was arriving, visibly and too late, at a different conclusion. She looked back at him steadily. She let him see that she wasn't afraid of him, which was true. She had been afraid of him 3 weeks ago. Not of him personally, but of the thing he represented, the machinery of power arranged against people who didn't have the right kind of standing. She was still aware of that machinery, but she had learned something about it in 3 weeks of preparation. Machinery had mechanisms. Mechanisms could be understood. Things that could be understood could be engaged with, on the right ground, with the right preparation. She had chosen her ground carefully. The commission recessed at 11:30 for deliberation. Mara went to the hallway outside the chamber, found a bench against the wall, and sat down. Cole came out 2 minutes later and sat beside her, leaving a reasonable distance between them. "How do you feel?" he said. She thought about it. Her hands were not shaking. She had expected them to shake. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me when they come back." "You were—" He stopped. "Don't," she said. "Don't what?" "Whatever compliment you were about to give me," she said. "I'll accept it later. Right now I need to sit here and not think about anything for a few minutes." He was quiet. Then, "All right." They sat in the hallway. Somewhere down the corridor a door opened and closed. The building had the particular silence of official spaces. Thick walls, high ceilings, the sound of the city outside rendered distant and irrelevant. Burke came out at one point, said he thought Aldridge was with them, and Prewitt was close, said nothing about Holloway, went back in. At 12:40 the commission returned. Aldridge spoke. He spoke for 6 minutes, which Mara tracked by the clock on the chamber wall. He said the commission found sufficient basis in the presented documentation to warrant a formal investigation into the practices of Mercer Territorial Bank with specific reference to the accounts and periods identified in the complaint. He said the commission was referring the matter to the Territorial Attorney's Office for further review. He said that pending that review, any foreclosure proceedings against properties named in the complaint were suspended. He said it in the flat, procedural voice of a man reading from a determination he'd written carefully, which meant he'd written it before he came back into the room, which meant the deliberation had gone the way Burke had thought it would go. Mercer did not react visibly. His attorneys began collecting their papers. Mara sat at the right table and did not react either, for a different reason. She was still adding up what it meant, not the victory, which she was not ready to call a victory, but the fact of what had happened, that she had stood in a room where the architecture had been arranged against her, with a man who owned a bank and 2 lawyers and 30 people in the gallery, and she had presented 41 pages of documented facts, and the facts had been sufficient. Not because she was extraordinary, because the facts were facts. Burke was speaking to her, something about next steps, the attorney's office timeline, additional documentation they might request. She was listening. She was also watching Mercer stand from his table. He was moving toward the door, and he was going to pass within 10 feet of where she was sitting, and she made a decision, not calculated, not strategic, simply the decision of a person who has something that needs to be said and may not have another occasion to say it. "Mr. Mercer," she said. He stopped. Half the room was still there. His attorneys, Burke, Cole standing near the wall, several gallery members who hadn't left yet. She stood up. Because she wasn't going to say this sitting down. "I want you to understand something," she said. Her voice was even. "Not about the investigation, not about the legal outcome, about what you did when you came into my family's house." She held his gaze. "You looked at a woman who had worked herself to the bone for 11 years and was exhausted and running out of options, and you decided that was the right moment to offer her a transaction. You decided her circumstances made her available." She paused. "I need you to know that it didn't. It made me angry, and I do better work when I'm angry." The room was absolutely still. Mercer looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, somewhere between contempt and very far underneath it, something that might have been unwilling recognition. He walked out without speaking. She sat back down. Burke said quietly, "That was either going to make things harder or it was necessary." "It was necessary," she said. "It won't make things harder." Cole said nothing. When she glanced at him, his face had the expression she'd been cataloging for 3 weeks, the one she still hadn't named. But she was closer to naming it now. They rode back to Ashford Ridge that evening. The cold was different on the return. The same temperature, the same October dark, but her body received it differently. She was not numb in any of the places she'd been numb on the way out from Red Hollow 6 weeks ago. She felt the cold as a fact, not as an additional weight. Cole rode beside her without speaking for the first hour, and she was glad of it. Then he said, "Your father sent a letter to the ranch. It arrived the day before we left for Helena. He reached into his coat and produced it. I should have given it to you sooner. I wasn't sure of the timing. She took it. She didn't open it immediately. She rode with it in her hand for another mile, feeling the paper in her fingers. Then she opened it. Harold Whitlock's handwriting was unsteady, in the way of a man writing something he'd started and stopped several times. She could see it in the letter, the places where the pressure of the pen changed, where a sentence had been crossed out and replaced. He wrote that he'd had a visit from Mrs. Dempsey from the general store, who had heard from someone who knew someone in Helena that there was a hearing involving Mercer's bank. He wrote that he'd pulled out the original copy of the August 15th letter, the one from Mercer's office, and had read it again, and that reading it again with the distance of weeks had clarified something he believed he'd been refusing to see when it arrived. He wrote, I know what I agreed to. I know what it would have meant for you. I've been telling myself it was the only option, and I think I told myself that because it was easier than looking for another one, and looking for another one would have required admitting that what we were asking was wrong. He wrote, I'm not asking you to come back. I don't think that's mine to ask. I'm asking if you would be willing, at some point, to let me try to be a father to you in whatever way you're willing to accept. He wrote, Dorothea says I'm a fool for writing this. She's probably right. I'm writing it anyway. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket. He wants to try, she said. Not to Cole specifically, just said it. What do you want to do with that? Cole said. She thought about the question, the real version of it, not the polite version. I want to help him get the ranch's books in order, she said after a while. From here. I can do that through correspondence. He needs someone to set up the accounts correctly, and I can do that without being there. She paused. And maybe, after some time, I want to sit across a table from him and have an actual conversation. Not about the ranch, just... She stopped. You don't have to know yet, Cole said. I know I don't, she said. I'm saying it out loud to hear what shape it has. He accepted that without pressing it further. They rode in silence for another stretch, and the silence was comfortable in the way that only happens between people who have spent enough time in the same spaces to stop requiring it to be filled. The lights of Ashford Ridge appeared on the ridge above them, the familiar sequence of them. Barn lamp first, then the main house, then the smaller glow from the bunkhouse windows. And Mara felt something she had not felt approaching a home in a very long time. She felt something like being expected, not in the demanding sense, not the way the Whitlock house had expected her, with a list of requirements and no acknowledgement that meeting them cost anything. Something quieter. The lights were on because people were there, and people were there because it was the end of a day, and this was where they belonged. She had not belonged somewhere in a long time. She was aware that she was not ready to say that to anyone yet. But she was aware of it. 3 weeks after the hearing, the first news came through Burke's office. The territorial attorney had opened a formal investigation into Mercer Territorial Bank. 2 additional families, not from Mara's filing, discovered in the course of the attorney's preliminary review, had come forward with their own accounts of irregular dealings. The investigation's scope had expanded before it had properly started, which Burke said in his letter was, in his experience, a sign of what lay underneath. A week after that came the news that the Garrison family, who had moved east 3 years ago after losing their land, had been contacted by the attorney's office. And then Harold Whitlock sent a second letter, shorter than the first. He wrote that a man from the attorney's office had come to Red Hollow and had sat in the kitchen and had asked to see the original August 15th letter, and that Harold had given it to him, and that afterward, sitting at the kitchen table alone for a while, he had understood for the first time the full dimension of what Mara had done. He wrote, You didn't just help yourself. You helped the Garrisons. You helped the Pendletons. You helped people you don't know and who don't know you, using records you kept for 9 years out of nothing but a feeling that something was wrong. I don't know where you got that. I'd like to think it was from me, but I know it wasn't. She read this letter at the desk in the East Room in the morning before the rest of the house was awake. The ridge outside the window was holding the early light the way it did at that hour, and she sat with the letter in her hands and let herself feel what it made her feel, which was complicated and not entirely comfortable, and also, underneath the complicated, something like the satisfaction of work that had mattered, not just to her, but to people outside the radius of her own life. She wrote back to him that evening. It was the first time she'd written to him voluntarily in 11 years. The letter was not long. She told him she'd review the ranch's financial records if he sent copies. She told him she wasn't ready for more than that yet, and she was asking him to accept the terms she could offer rather than the ones he wanted, which was a thing she'd been doing for other people her entire life and was only now learning to do for herself. She sealed the letter and left it on the hall table to go out with the morning post. Cole was in the kitchen when she came back through, which was unusual. He was normally in the barn at this hour. "Couldn't sleep," he said, by way of explanation that wasn't quite an explanation. "I wrote to my father," she said. He poured a second cup of coffee and set it on the table across from his. She sat down. This was the thing she had not expected and had not prepared for. The small domesticity of it. The kitchen in the early morning, 2 cups, the sound of the fire. She had prepared for hearings and investigations and legal complexity and the hard work of rebuilding something from complicated material. She had not prepared for the ease of sitting across a kitchen table from someone who simply made room for her without announcement. She wrapped both hands around the cup. "Cole," she said. He looked at her. She had been thinking about this for 3 weeks, and she had decided that she was not going to handle it the way she had handled everything else in her life. Quietly, deferring the difficult thing until the difficult thing could no longer be deferred. She was going to handle it by saying the true version. "I'm not grateful to you," she said. He blinked. "I mean, I am, for specific things. The lawyer, purchasing the debt, giving me this room." She kept her eyes on him. "But I need you to know that what happened in Helena, what's happening with the investigation, what I built in these 3 weeks, that's not something I could do because you gave me resources. That's something I could do because I could always do it. I just never had the room." He was quiet. "I know that," he said. "I need to know that you know it," she said, "because I've been someone's solution before. I've been useful to people in ways that got described as being valued, and I'm not doing that again." She took a breath. "If what I am to you is impressive, if it's the competence or the 41 pages or the hearing, I need to know that now before—" She stopped. "Before what?" he said. She held his gaze. "Before I decide anything further." Cole set down his cup. He looked at her in the way she'd catalogued over weeks, the look she had not quite named. "What you are to me," he said slowly, "is the person I want to have coffee with at 5 in the morning when neither of us can sleep. The person I want to disagree with about hay contracts. The person who told me the truth about a dead-end fence post the second day we met, when you had no reason to and no idea who I was, and who has not stopped telling me the truth since." He stopped. "The 41 pages are extraordinary. You are more than the 41 pages." She sat with that. She looked at him. This man she hadn't known 3 months ago, this man who had lied to her and then handed her the truth, and then had the patience to let her work out what to do with both. And she thought about what it meant to be in a kitchen at 5 in the morning on the other side of the hardest thing she'd ever done, and to feel, against all reasonable expectation, like she was in the right place. She was not ready to say that yet, but she was almost ready. "Ask me again in a month," she said. "All right," he said. She drank her coffee. He drank his. Outside the window, the ridge was going gold with the morning, the cold, clean light that came in November when the season had fully decided what it was going to be. She had 41 pages of documentation with her name on them in the hands of the territorial attorney's office. She had a letter in the outgoing post to a father she was choosing, carefully and on her own terms, to let back in. She had a room with a good desk and a house on a ridge that was starting, quietly and without ceremony, to feel like it had something to do with her. And she had the particular feeling, unfamiliar enough to still catch her off guard, of a life that was being shaped by her own hands, her own choices, and nobody else's arithmetic. She finished her coffee. "The winter hay contracts," she said. "When do those renew?" Cole looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Second week of December." "I'd like to handle the negotiation," she said. "I know," he said. The hay contract negotiation took 3 days. Not because the vendor was difficult, though he was, but because Mara had decided before she walked into that meeting in the feed merchant's office in Helena that she was going to establish from the first exchange exactly what kind of negotiation this was going to be. Not the kind where Ashford Ridge came in needing hay and the merchant knew it and priced accordingly. The kind where Ashford Ridge came in with 3 competing quotes, a clear understanding of the valley's supply situation for the coming winter, and a woman across the table who had read every contract the merchant had issued to ranches in the territory for the past 4 years. She had obtained those contracts from the public commercial registry, which anyone could access and almost nobody did because it required 2 days in a filing room and the patience to read dense contractual language for hours at a stretch. Mara had found it straightforward. It was just numbers arranged in a sequence. Numbers arranged in sequences were what she did. The merchant's name was Calhoun. I was a big man, accustomed to filling a room with his size and his certainty, and he had looked at her when she walked in with the particular expression she'd grown accustomed to receiving. Not hostile, just the automatic recalibration of a man deciding how seriously to take who he was dealing with. She had put the competing quotes on the table first, then the 4 years of contracts. By the end of the first day, Calhoun had dropped his opening price by 9%. By the end of the third day, they had agreed to terms 14% below what Hatch had paid the previous winter. With a 2-year lock-in that protected Ashford Ridge against the price increases everyone in the valley knew were coming as the cattle population grew. She came back to the ranch on the third evening and told Cole the number. He was quiet for a moment. 14%. And locked for 2 years, she said. He looked at her with the expression she had finally, sometime in the past month, succeeded in naming. It was not admiration exactly, though it contained that. It was something closer to recognition, the look of someone who has found the thing they were looking for and is still slightly surprised that it turned out to be real. Hatch is going to say you should have been doing this for years, Cole said. Hatch would be right, she said. She hung her coat on the hook by the door, which was where she always hung it now, and went to the office to write up the contract terms before the details softened in her memory. And the ranch went on around her the way it did. The sounds of the barn, the cold settling into the walls from outside, the particular quality of an evening in December on a Montana ridge, when the work of the day is finished and the house holds the warmth of it. She had been at Ashford Ridge for 2 months. The territorial attorney's investigation into Mercer's bank had been running for 6 weeks by then, and the shape of it was becoming clear in the way that large things become clear, slowly, through accumulation. Burke sent updates every week or so. The attorney's office had found what Mara had suspected. The Whitlock account was not an isolated case. It was not even the most egregious one. There were 7 families in the formal complaint now, 4 of them identified by the attorney's investigators after Mara's filing opened the door. The Garrison family's land had been assessed at artificially low value before sale, documentation suggested, specifically to clear the path for a Mercer-affiliated buyer. The Pendleton water rights had been transferred under a clause in the original loan agreement that the Pendleton widow had signed without being told what it contained. Mercer's attorneys were fighting everything, which Burke said was expected and would slow things down but not change the direction. The direction was not good for Gideon Mercer. His business relationships in the territory were becoming careful with him in the way that business relationships become careful when a man's solidity is in question. Not openly hostile, just slightly less available. 2 board members of the bank had, according to Burke's sources, begun the process of distancing themselves from Mercer's personal decisions. The Helena Gazette had run a piece, careful, thoroughly qualified, the kind of piece written by someone who had a lawyer read it before publication, about the investigation, and the county assessor who had appeared at the hearing had quietly resigned his position the week after. None of this was swift. None of it was clean. The law moved the way rivers moved, with an ultimate direction that was hard to argue with, but through channels that bent and doubled back and took longer than anyone wanted. But it was moving. She wrote to her father with the updates as she received them, stripping out the legal language and translating it into the kind of plain accounting he'd be able to follow. This had become, over 2 months, the rhythm of their correspondence. She sent the facts. He sent back responses that were gradually becoming less formal, less careful, more like the man she'd known before grief, and a second marriage had made him into a version of himself she barely recognized. In early December, he sent a letter that was different in tone from the others. He wrote that Dorothea had left. Not dramatically. There had been no confrontation, no scene. She had simply, over the course of November, become quieter and then more absent, and then one morning had packed 2 trunks and informed Harold that she intended to visit her sister in Cheyenne and that the length of the visit was undetermined. She'd taken Cecile. Faye had stayed, which Harold said he hadn't expected, and which had led to a conversation between Faye and Harold that he described only as long and necessary. He wrote, "I think Faye was as tired as you were. She just didn't have your way of showing it." Mara read that sentence several times. She had never had a relationship with either stepsister that went beyond functional coexistence, and the idea of Faye being tired, of carrying something without acknowledgement in a different direction, but a parallel one, was complicated in a way she hadn't anticipated. She wrote back and asked if Faye needed work. She had been careful about how she phrased it, not charity, work. Faye was good with horses in the way that some people were, instinctively, with a patience that didn't seem to cost her anything. Ashford Ridge could use someone with that skill in the spring when the new stock came in. It was not a gesture of warmth, exactly. It was the thing Mara was, practical about what people needed and what she could offer. But it was something. Cole read the letter over her shoulder when she was writing it. Not intrusively, she'd left it on the desk in the office, and he'd come in and she'd told him to read it rather than summarize. And when she handed it to the outgoing post, he said, "That was generous." "It was practical," she said. "It can be both." "Both," he said. She considered that. "Yes," she said. "I suppose it can." December in Montana on a ridge at 4,000 feet was not a subtle season. It came in heavy and serious and required things from a ranch in the specific language of severe cold. Water lines checked twice daily. Livestock moved to covered pens. Feed calculated against the length of winter with a margin for error, because the margin for error in a hard winter was the difference between a herd intact and a herd diminished. Mara threw herself into the logistics of it with the focus of someone who had found, at last, a problem proportionate to her capability. Hatch watched her reorganize the winter feeding schedule, not replace his system, but identify the two places where it was inefficient and propose adjustments, and said, in the tone of a man offering the highest compliment he had available, "You know, I've been running this operation for 11 years. "I know," she said. "You've done it well." "But," he said. "But you've been doing it the same way for 11 years, she said, "which means you've been leaving the same margin on the table for 11 years, and margins matter in a hard winter." He was quiet for a moment. "You're not wrong," he said. He paused. "You're irritating, but you're not wrong." "I can live with that," she said. He almost smiled, the same almost as always. The ceremony happened in the last week of January. It was not, in the end, a large affair. Not because anyone had decided to make it small. It simply was what it was, shaped by the people in the place. The minister from the nearest town, a man named Reverend Alcott, who had married 3 couples from Ashford Ridge over the years, and knew Cole well enough to shake his hand before any formal greeting. Hatch, who stood beside Cole in the capacity of a man who had been asked specifically and had accepted with the minimum of ceremony. A woman named Clara, who had worked the ranch kitchen for 8 years, and who had, over 2 months, become the closest thing Mara had to a friend on the property. Not through any particular effort on either side, but through proximity and the honest respect of 2 women who both believed that work done well was its own kind of language. Harold Whitlock came. That was the part she hadn't known, until he arrived the evening before, whether he would actually do. He had written that he intended to come. She had believed him and not believed him simultaneously, which was the honest state of a woman rebuilding trust in increments rather than wholesale. He arrived in a rented buggy, alone, and he stood in the yard of Ashford Ridge with his hat in his hands and looked at the property with an expression she read correctly. Not the property itself, but what it meant. That she had built something here, that she had been received here as someone who mattered, that the life he had nearly prevented her from having was real and substantial and hers. She went out to meet him. They stood in the yard in the January cold for a moment without speaking, which was perhaps the most honest thing they had managed in years. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said. He nodded. He looked down at his hat. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "If there's a right way to be here, I don't know what it is." "There isn't a right way," she said. "Just be here." He looked up. In his pale eyes, she saw the flicker she had spent years watching for. The real thing. Underneath the habitual looking away. It was still there. That was what she had needed to know. Not that he was fixed, not that the years of silence were undone, but that the thing she'd once loved in him wasn't entirely gone. That it was recoverable, given time and care, and both of them willing to do the work of it. "All right," he said. "Then I'm here." She nodded. "Come inside, it's cold." He stayed through the ceremony and the evening after. Cole shook his hand and meant it. She watched the handshake and knew it was genuine, because Cole's handshakes were always genuine, which was one of the things she had cataloged early and trusted now. Harold sat at the dinner table that evening between Clara and Hatch and said almost nothing but was present in the real sense, not the performing present sense, and Mara watched him from across the table and thought, this is a beginning, small, uncertain, but a beginning. He left the next morning. Before he got in the buggy, he reached into his coat and handed her an envelope. "The original of the August 15th letter," he said. "Burke said the attorney's office has a copy now, so the original can go to you. I thought—" He stopped. "I thought it should be yours." She took the envelope. She understood what he was giving her, not the letter specifically, the acknowledgement contained in it, the admission that the thing had happened, that he had known it was wrong, and that she deserved to hold the evidence of that in her own hands. "Thank you," she said. He got in the buggy and left, and she stood in the yard in the January cold and watched him go, and she let herself feel the full complicated weight of what that moment was without trying to resolve it into something simpler. It was not resolution, it was not forgiveness, or not entirely. It was the beginning of a long, slow piece of work that would have good days and setbacks, and moments of unexpected warmth, and moments where the old hurt surfaced and had to be acknowledged before it could be set back down. It was real. That was the thing about it. It was real in the way that only difficult things are real. With all the rough edges intact, nothing smoothed or simplified, requiring continued attention rather than a single decisive act. She put the envelope in her coat pocket and went back inside. The month of February arrived and brought with it the final substantive news from Burke's office. The territorial attorney had completed the investigative phase and was proceeding to formal charges against Gideon Mercer for predatory lending practices, fraudulent assessment collusion, and coercive commercial conduct. 3 of the 7 families in the complaint were entitled to financial remedy under territorial statute. The garrison land could not be returned. It had changed hands twice since the forced sale. But the financial assessment of what they were owed was substantial. The Pendleton water rights were being reviewed for restoration. The Whitlock debt, already purchased by Cole and being repaid by Mara at 5% on a schedule she'd set herself, was separately cleared of all penalty charges that the investigation determined had been improperly applied. That reduced the principal by more than 30%. She did the arithmetic when Burke's letter arrived, sitting at the desk in the East Room, and the number she arrived at was smaller and more manageable than any number connected to that debt had been since she'd first understood how serious it was. She wrote it in a letter to her father with no additional comment because the number was the comment. He wrote back a single line. "I didn't understand until now what you had been carrying." She put that letter in the drawer of the desk where she kept things she wanted to keep, and she went back to work. The spring brought new stock and Faye Whitlock. Faye arrived in March, quieter than Mara had ever seen her, which was saying something because Faye had always been the quieter stepsister. She came with a single bag and a question in her eyes that she didn't ask aloud, which Mara interpreted correctly as, "Is this actually available to me, or is it charity wrapped in a job offer?" Mara put her to work the first morning, not the gentle introduction kind of work, real work, the horse work, because Faye was good with horses, and starting someone with what they're good at was the fastest way to establish that their presence on the property was based on merit rather than obligation. By the end of the first week, 2 of the ranch hands had separately mentioned to Hatch that the new woman had a way with the young stock that was worth keeping. Hatch told Mara. Mara told Faye. Faye received the information with a kind of stunned stillness that told Mara more about what Faye's life had been like at the Whitlock Ranch than anything Faye had said directly. "You didn't know you were good at it?" Mara asked. "Nobody—" Faye stopped. "No one mentioned it." "Well," Mara said, "you are." It was not a warm conversation. They were not, and might never be, women who spoke to each other with warmth as the primary mode. But something in Faye's face shifted, and Mara recognized the shift because she had felt its equivalent herself. Standing in a barn in October, being told by someone for the first time that what she was good at was worth something. She let Faye have it without making it into more than it was. The spring was good. Not perfect, There was a late frost in April that cost them 3 days of work and complicated the planting schedule for the kitchen garden, and one of the new stock horses turned out to have a temperament problem that required significant management, and there was a dispute with a neighboring property over a fence line that took 6 weeks to resolve. Real things, the kind that didn't resolve cleanly and required patience and compromise and a willingness to accept partial victories. But the ranch grew through it. The cattle operation expanded by 40 head. The hay contract Mara had negotiated saved them exactly what she'd projected, which gave them capital to upgrade the secondary barn in a way that had been deferred for 3 years. Hatch stopped almost smiling and started occasionally actually smiling, which Clara said was unprecedented. One evening in late April, Mara was at the desk finishing the spring accounts, when Cole came in and sat in the chair across from her and said nothing for a moment, which meant he had something he was working out how to say. She kept writing. She had learned that he did better if she didn't face him directly when he was working something out. Something about being watched made him careful in a way that slowed the process. "I want to say something," he said. "All right," she said, without looking up. "Not about the ranch," he said. She stopped writing. She put the pen down and looked at him. "When I came to Red Hollow," he said, "I told myself I was conducting an experiment, that I was going to observe and assess and come to a rational conclusion." He held her gaze. "I want you to know that the rational part stopped approximately the second day. When you fixed the fence anyway, knowing it wasn't going to hold properly, because it needed to hold for now, and now was what mattered." He paused. "That's when I stopped being rational about it." She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. He blinked. "You know." "I've known for a while," she said. "I was waiting for you to say it properly." He absorbed that. "How long is a while?" "The coffee at midnight," she said. "In the barn, the second week." He was quiet. "That was just coffee." "Cole," she said, "people who are conducting rational experiments don't make coffee at midnight for the subject of the experiment." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I should have told you who I was earlier." "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I'm sorry," he said. Not the formal version. The real version. The 2 words without anything around them, nothing to soften them or explain them away. She had been waiting for that too. Not consciously, not as a demand, but it had been sitting between them since the barn in October, and she had known it would need to be said cleanly before she could fully set it down. "I know you are," she said, "and I believe you." Which is different from saying it doesn't matter. It matters, but it's not... She stopped, found the right words. "It's not the thing I'm going to use to define what this is." "What is this?" he said. She thought about the question seriously, the way she thought about all serious questions. "Something I chose," she said. "That's what it is. I chose it knowing who you were and what you'd done and what this place was and what it wasn't. I chose it because I wanted to, not because I was out of options." She looked at him steadily. "That's the thing I needed it to be." He nodded, slowly, like a man receiving something he'd been careful not to expect. "It is that," he said. "I know," she said. She picked up her pen and went back to the accounts, and he stayed in the chair across from her, and the office held them both in the particular quiet of a place where 2 people have found a shared language and are no longer translating. Later that summer, a young woman arrived at the gate of Ashford Ridge on a borrowed horse, with nothing but a canvas bag and the look of someone who had rehearsed their arrival a dozen times and was discovering that the rehearsal hadn't covered this exact moment. She was perhaps 23. Her hands were rough in the way of someone who'd been working hard for a long time. Her dress was too thin for the altitude, which told Mara she'd come from lower country. Her eyes moved quickly over the property, assessing exits, which told Mara something else. Mara was in the yard when she arrived. She had been inspecting the fence repair from the spring, still checking it 2 months later, because that was the kind of person she was. The young woman pulled the horse up and looked at her. "I heard," she started, then stopped. "Someone in town said this ranch gives work to people who need a start." She said it carefully, the way you say something you're not sure will land the way you mean it. "I don't know if that's true. I'm not looking for charity. I can work." Mara looked at her, not at her dress or her horse or the thinness of her bag, at her hands, which were honest, at her eyes, which were frightened, and also, underneath the frightened, determined. The particular determination of someone who has run out of easier options but has not run out of options entirely and knows the difference. She recognized it. She knew it from the inside. "What can you do?" she said. The young woman blinked. She'd expected something else, a question about where she was from or why she'd come, or a polite version of no. "Accounts," she said, gathering herself. "I can keep books, and I'm good with vegetable crops, and I can cook if it's for a working household rather than a formal one, and I learn fast." Mara nodded. "Accounts I have handled," she said. "But the kitchen garden is Faye's project, and she's been saying for 2 weeks she needs someone who knows crops, and Clara can always use an extra pair of hands in the kitchen. The pay is—" She named a number. It was fair. Not generous, but fair, which was better than generous because fair was sustainable. The young woman's expression moved through several things quickly. Relief, then the wariness of relief, which was the appropriate response to good news when you'd learned not to trust it. "I'm not a charity case," she said again. "I know," Mara said. "I didn't offer you charity. I offered you a job." She turned toward the house. "Come in and have something to eat and I'll show you around." She heard the young woman dismount behind her, heard the small catch in her breath, the exhale of someone who has been holding something for too long and has found, unexpectedly, somewhere to set it down. Mara did not look back. She had learned, over months of watching Cole, that some moments were better not witnessed, that the most important ones sometimes needed to be private. Cole was on the porch when she came up with the young woman behind her. He looked at the scene, understood it in the way he understood things, quickly, without needing it explained, and moved aside to let them both through the door. When the young woman had been taken to the kitchen by Clara, and the sound of introductions was coming from that direction, Cole came and stood beside Mara on the porch. "Another one," he said. Not critically, just noting. "She knows accounts," Mara said. "You know accounts." "She needed somewhere," Mara said, "and she's willing to work for it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Hatch is going to complain about the bunkhouse space." "I'll talk to Hatch," she said. She looked out at the ridge. The late summer light was on it, the long gold of an afternoon that didn't want to end, and the property spread out below it. The barn, the pens, the kitchen garden. Faye had turned into something real, the fence line that had been repaired and was holding. The horses moving in the far pasture. The whole accumulated fact of a place that worked, that produced, that gave back something proportionate to what it asked. She had not built this. It had existed before her, but she had changed its shape, the way a good set of hands changes the shape of something they work with long enough. Not replacing what was there, but finding what it was capable of that it hadn't been asked for yet. She thought about Gideon Mercer, whose formal charges were working through the legal system at the pace of formal charges, which was slow but inexorable. She thought about the 7 families whose accounts had been included in the complaint, about the Garrison family receiving financial remedy after 3 years of believing they'd simply lost, about the small ways that a thing done right keeps producing effects beyond the moment it was done. She thought about a fence post in frozen October ground, and a man who'd told her it would crack out when it thawed, and her own answer, it needs to hold until spring, and what happens in spring is spring's problem. She had not known, then, what spring was going to be. Cole's hand found hers on the porch railing. Not a dramatic gesture, just his hand next to hers, and then around it, the way things that are meant to stay do, without announcement, without ceremony, simply by being present until the presence becomes the fact. "The accounts girl," he said. "What's her name?" "I didn't ask yet," Mara said. "You offered her a job without asking her name." "I asked what she could do," Mara said. "That seemed more important." He considered that. "I suppose it is." They stood on the porch while the afternoon light moved across the ridge the way it always did, and below them the ranch went on in the language of a place that had its rhythms sorted and its people settled and its work continuous and real, and in the kitchen a young woman who had arrived with a canvas bag and frightened eyes was learning the names of the people around her, and somewhere in the territory a legal process was grinding toward an accounting that 7 families had stopped believing would ever come. And in a drawer in the East Room a letter from a father sat beside a copy of a document that had changed the direction of more lives than its author had intended when she'd started writing it by lamplight with a cramped hand and something to prove. The ranch had a name. It had always had a name, Ashford Ridge, the same name it would keep. But it had become, over the course of less than a year, something different from what the name had described before. Not because it had been transformed dramatically, but because the person at the center of it was different from the person who had been there before. And that difference, one person's refusal to be bought, one person's decision to stay angry in productive directions, one person's habit of keeping copies of everything, had rippled outward in ways that neither the person nor anyone around her had fully mapped yet. That was the thing about real change. It rarely arrived like weather, announced, visible, arriving all at once. It arrived the way winter feeding schedules improved, or the way a father's handwriting in a letter gradually lost its careful formality, or the way a young woman's shoulders dropped by half an inch as she sat down at a table where someone had asked what she could do before asking anything else. Small, continuous, requiring attention to notice. Mara noticed everything. She always had. It had just taken her this long to find a place large enough to hold what she could see. She was 32 years old. Her hands were still calloused, and she still rose before dawn from habit, and she was still not, by any measure that most of Red Hollow would have recognized, a woman who looked like what she had become. That was fine. She had stopped expecting Red Hollow to be the place that measured her accurately. She had found better measures. The accounts balanced, the cattle were sound, the fences held through winter and were repaired in spring without drama. The people who came through the gate needing something left with something real. And at the end of the day, on a porch on a ridge in Montana, there was a hand that reached for hers without making it into a statement. That was enough. Not a small enough, a large enough. The kind that continued past the moment you were standing in, into the next day and the one after, built out of nothing more and nothing less than what was true. She held on. The light moved. The ridge held its gold. The ranch went on.